Okay, everybody can hear me in the back, fine. Okay, then I'm not going to use the mic. So if you were here for Steve's talk prior to mine, it actually is a great segue into what I'm going to cover here today. And then the two women coming after me are going to really take what I present, I think, and really drive it home as to what the responsibility might be for private landowners to consider. So you can go ahead and dim the lights. The project that I'm going to talk about today, or the work that I'm going to present, is based on a larger project that we're doing at the Extension Office here, and a multitude of funding sources. So I just want to acknowledge those folks. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, the title of my talk is Who Protects Who? Native grasslands and the relationship between native grasslands and streams in the Big Sioux drainage in particular. But first we got to kind of talk about what is native. And when I'm talking about native grasslands, I'm talking about grasslands that have never been tilled, never been actively converted to crops or other uses. It doesn't necessarily mean, toward the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about the quality of those grasslands. But that's what we're talking about when we say native grasslands. Not planted, not CRP, but truly native sod. And this is why it's a big deal, because we still have land conversion going on in the Big Sioux watershed, the Big Sioux corridor, and throughout the state. This is Grant County in 2013, and like I said, we still have what I would call poor land use decisions going on in the watershed and in the region. And what I'm trying to do with my work and my team is quantify those changes, or quantify where we're at today with the status of our native grasslands, so we can start to talk knowledgeably in the future about rates of change. And if we think it's if we think it's gone away, it hasn't. This was 2 weeks ago in Grant County. About 1,000 acres of grassland went down, about 250 of which I determined, after looking at my maps and stuff, that was probably native, had previously unbroken sod. And that kind of land use practice has an impact on our water. This is Day County in 2015, conversion of native grasslands to agricultural uses. And so what we're doing with our project is, just in a nutshell here, what you see as, I don't know if this is a pointer, yeah. What you see as green by order of deduction, I'm not going to go through the entire process with you, but by order of deduction, we are mapping and inventorying what we determine to be the last remaining native grasslands across the state. This is what eastern South Dakota looks like. Now that doesn't mean that all of what you see in black here is actually black today. This is what we call the negative shot. This means that all of the land that's in black at one time had been converted or is consequently non-native land, leaving only about, roughly, after we take out the water, about 24% of eastern South Dakota is native. 73% or so has been converted at some point in the past. This is what the positive shot looks like. So we got about 5.5 million acres of grassland, native grassland left in eastern South Dakota. Okay, that just kind of sets the framework for what I wanted to share with you. With our work, we were able to, because it's GIS based, the tools you can drill into really land at any level. So I'm just showing you that here that we've got, this is Coddington County. And we can drill in even to the tract level, the ranch level, the farm level. You really get a pretty good indication of what the land looks like. We can also use various tools to overlay streams and things like that on this layer to get a better picture of how things are interrelated. So when we get to the Big Sioux River watershed, we can apply our same tools and take a closer look. So here's the upper Big Sioux region, Watertown, South Dakota's rising star, right? I don't know, do they still use that as a slogan? I don't know, what is our slogan? Do we have one anymore? Okay. Anyway, when we overlay the Big Sioux River watershed, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of streams and tributaries coming off this is the eastern slope of the Prairie Coteau, and then there's just, there's the watershed break here, and so we do have several streams coming back down through the Big Sioux River watershed. If we take a closer look at that, we can overlay that native lands layer that we created. And if you see here, look how linear all of this undisturbed prairie is. Makes sense, right? It's along the watersheds. So here's that question, who protects who? Do the native grasslands remain because of the water, or does the water quality remain because of the native grass? And it's really a question that's somewhat unanswerable. It's both and. But that's what that looks like. But here's the bigger thing. How much of that is protected from future conversion to crops or other uses? And you see not much in the watershed. The purple is protected. Right outside the Big Sioux watershed on the eastern slope of the Coteau, we have quite a bit of protection. And that's primarily in the form of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service easements and other programs. And right up here, you know, that's kind of up in that eastern Grant County area. There's quite a bit on the Coteau. But other than that, we're pretty much in farm country. And when you layer all three of them together, you probably can't see that very well. I apologize for that. But by layering all three together, you can do some analysis. If you blow it up even closer to, say, Cottington County in particular, to the Watertown region, it becomes a little more clear what that interaction looks like. And you can see that there's a great many streams that flow through grassland areas, but there's also a great many that don't. And there's a lot of water, there's a lot of sources and upper watersheds on these tributaries that really are originating in crop ground. What the math looks like, if you look at the different regions of the Big Sioux, the upper, middle, and lower Big Sioux, basically the upper Big Sioux, in this region, we've got about 20% of that landscape remains as undisturbed or native grassland. About 12% in the middle, and only about 10% in the lower Big Sioux. So not a huge footprint of actual native grassland. And again, I want to remind you that there are other permanent cover types out there, but we were just looking at native grass. When you throw on the protection then of those grasslands, and will they be there for the future? Will they be retained? The numbers look a little more dire. Only 4% of the native grassland in the upper Big Sioux is actually protected from future conversion. Only about 1.7% in the middle, and about half of 1% in the lower Big Sioux. Now, does that mean that it's eminently threatened to be converted to crops? Probably not. These are steep, rugged areas along creeks and everything. But the reality is that there's no guarantee that they're going to be there in the future. So it's just an interesting factoids about the river. So what about the Big Sioux River Basin, you know, as far as quality? Now, I'm a range and pasture guy, and so I'm going to preface this with, it's easy to pick on row crop A. It's easy to point the finger that way, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, but we're also going to go back to pasture management at the end here. A lot of our streams in the Big Sioux do originate on pasture, and one would argue that this is a better overall source than what we see flowing out after it leaves pasture. I think that's true. As far as water quality, this is a lot of what we see. If you saw Steve's presentation prior to mine, this is just more of a repeat of practices, but we still see these conversion. You know, this was all native grassland right next to the Big Sioux River in Cottington County, and 2 weeks later it was tiled. So that's important stuff. We get down to that Brookings region, and it's kind of a stark contrast. Now, like I said, there's less grassland down in that area. And everything that I just shaded white is previously disturbed land. So we're not working with much left in a lot of these areas, in a lot of these watersheds. And it's really open to, this word is getting really grind on me, is this sustainability. It's being used everywhere for everything to try to put a positive spin on impacts on land and land use and everything else. And then I'm not picking on the U.S. soybean board here, but what the reality is that sustainability is in the eye of the beholder. There's probably no doubt that maybe they're raising beans here in a sustainable manner, but is it sustainable for the landscape? Narrow buffers, linear ditched streams. I grew up in this country, so this is this is western Minnesota, and I would argue that that's not a sustainable way for our land management to go in the long haul, and probably is not going to be sustainable for our crop systems either. But we also have a responsibility on pasture, and that's really what I wanted to touch on today too, is that sometimes in the pasture world, in the grazing world, in the range management world, we seem to always want to take the high road and say, well, at least we're not cropping it. If you saw the rainfall simulator outside on your way in, you'll know that this type of pasture management is about equal to cropping as far as runoff and as far as sediment and erosion and inputs into our rivers and streams. And there is a ton of this type of management along the Big Sioux corridor, up and down the Big Sioux corridor. Very little prairie left down in that Brookings region. I think my slide might have got switched around here. I'm going to skip through that. But we do see what I'm going to say are poor grazing management practices up and down the corridor. So it's a both and. Both ends of the industry are equally responsible. Steve showed a lot of pictures of cattle in the river. I don't need to show that anymore. But I want to concentrate is on this. This is not sustainable either. So just because we have grass that's buffering the Big Sioux River tributaries, I'm not sure that we can assume that they're doing much for the quality of the water when they're being managed in this fashion. And so, we have a responsibility. Forested areas, there's hardwoods and then there's planted cedars, and there's a lot of places on the lower Big Sioux that we see a lot of cedar trees, especially on the tributaries, and that is also an erosion potential. There's nothing protecting that ground, so we have to be very, very aware of our assumptions, I guess, on land use and land cover along those corridors. Like I said, the rainfall simulator is a great example. And look at this right here. If I wouldn't have had this label on here, you would have thought that was the conventional cropping jar. But that's pasture. That's just simply poorly managed pasture, and that's the runoff that comes on. And look how poor the infiltration is on that as well, compared to well-managed pasture. So that's an important takeaway. It's about understanding our role as range managers, land managers, and what we're sending downstream. And like I said, the next two presenters are going to really drive that responsibility, that land ethic home as regard to how they're managing their ranches in the context of water quality. So our future is really important, and I was happy to have the opportunity to share some of this with you today. So thank you very much. Those are, one of them is, the rest of them are a bunch of hoodlums he hangs out with.
Next we will have, Arla? Arla, yes, good. Arla Heyman Poindexter. Yep, very good. Arla is a rancher on Bluebell Ranch in Dual County. Through conservation of natural resources, the Bluebell Ranch has been more effective at managing cow-calf operation. The Bluebell Ranch and Heyman. Hey, I didn't write that first time. Heyman family was the recipient of the 2017 Leopold Conservation Award. So, did you want to get from the lights down?
Oh, whatever. You can judge that.
Okay.
Okay. So, like she said, I'm Arla Heyman Poindexter. I'm from the Bluebell Ranch. I'm here because we won the Leopold Award, which is given annually in South Dakota and other states up and down the Midwest by the Sand County Foundation, the Cattlemen's, the Grassland Coalition, and 21 partnering agencies. It was given in honor of conservationist Aldo Leopold, and he wrote a book called The Sand County Almanac, and it's a really great book, but he called for an ethical relationship between land and people. This is the Bluebell Ranch. If you're familiar with Dual County at all, it's about halfway between Geary and Clear Lake. You can see Highway 22 right through there. The ranch is about 5,500 acres. Most of it is protected by U.S. Fish and Wildlife permanent easement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. To give you an idea, though, this is the ranch, and this is the Coteau. And it's important to remember that everybody who's up and down the Coteau is trying to do the right thing for the land. Maybe they don't have all the information, the tools, but they're trying to do the right thing for their properties. Like any business, the ranch partners with a number of people. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife, mainly in the form of the easements, Game Fish and Parks, the Nature Conservancy, educators, guys like Pete and the Grassland Coalition. We partner with other local businesses, like our banks, our neighbors, farmers and ranchers, local feed suppliers, farm suppliers, local cooperatives, and then also our local governments too. All these partners care about the ranch. Most of it because of the ecological diversity. You know, you've got different plants, animals, bugs, and then we cohabitate livestock in amongst that too. We have to take a minute and talk about the cow herd. So the calves were born about the 1st of May. They'll spend the summer on the hills in the background there until about the 1st of December when we'll wean the calves. The cows never leave sod. So the calves will get weaned, they'll weigh about 500 pounds in December. They'll go to a custom feed yard. They'll stay there until they're about 1,000 pounds, so that'll be sometime next summer. And then we'll sell the calves to somebody who will put them in a feedlot and take them to a market weight. But the thing to remember about the cows and the calves, if this guy is going to do what we want him to do, from the time he's conceived to the time he's a steak on a plate, it comes down to 2 things, and that's healthy soil and clean water. And that's why landscape is so important. There's a natural function of that landscape, kind of like what Pete was talking about earlier. There's water flow, there's water capture and retention. Filtration is a huge, huge piece of that. And then grazing as a tool for conservation. So when we talk about filtration, like Pete was saying, it's kind of the chicken and the egg approach, which came first, healthy soils or clean water. This is the same pasture. It was taken about the 3rd week of August. The cattle had been in here for about 60 days and had been off this pasture for 2 weeks before I took these pictures. You can see here that this little pothole, and this pothole is only about half the size of this room. So this little pothole is full of water. But what you can't see is there's a drawback here, and that creek from the last slide, that's about where we would be standing. So that water is holding in that little pothole, filtering through the soil before it ends up in either one of those water sources. Now the rotational grazing is a big tool we use. And you can see here, Pete, if you know Pete at all, he talks a lot about the take half, leave half. So you take half the grass and you leave half the grass. And so that's an important piece of conservation when you talk about grazing, is maintaining some of that cover so that that water can filter through the soil better. And then you're also providing resources for next year's grass too. So this is a map of the ranch again. Yellow outline is the ranch perimeters. And then these yellow areas here, these are all areas that are protected by permanent grassland easements. And then the white lines are the creeks and the streams, the headwaters. So there's 13 of those, 11 of those are protected by permanent easements. But this creek that goes here, it's important to know that that's not a true headwater, but there are springs all the way up and down that. And then there's other water features too, the fens, which the Coteau has more of those than anywhere else in the world too. So those other water features are really important too. When we agreed to sign the easements, we were asked to restore some of the potholes. These had been drained in prior years, like probably in the 40s, 50s, 60s, somewhere in there. So we were asked to plug those. The before and after pictures, I wish I had them, but I don't. Those sloughs used to just be an absolute mud hole. The cows would wander in them. They would come out, they would be covered top to bottom in mud. The calves would try and suck. 3 to 7 days later, calves started getting sick. After we plugged those, the cows still wallow in there, but they come out, they're clean, the calves are healthy. Okay, this is not our piece of property. This is our piece of property, but this is owned by the Nature Conservancy currently. So when we signed our ranch up for the easements, we were told, and we received a lot of criticism for it, that we were making a permanent decision for future generations. Well, that's probably true, but we're making it on the error, if we're erring at all, we're making it on the, we're going to minimize our impact. This was all done by a previous landowner too, and those are permanent changes that may or may not be able to be reversed. This area down here, you can't really see it on that map, but that's one of those fens, and they had tried to tile around it, drain around it, and drain it into that dugout. That's something that the Nature Conservancy hasn't figured out yet, how they're going to reverse that impact. And the important thing to remember is that conservation always pays. In the short term, you have fewer expenses and more revenue. Remember that where I was talking about the plugs and the healthy calves? Not only did our vet costs decrease, we had a bigger calf, we had a healthier calf. When he went to the feed yard, it was less days on feed, so it was more money in our pocket. And in the long term, you have the sum of that year-to-year management, but then you also have an investment in the property you already own. How many of you have like a retirement account or a pension? Okay, it's the same kind of deal. This grass here, this is providing a future for next year. We already have a nice cover, so that if we have a cold spring or we have a dry summer, we have a good foundation for grass for 2018. And then the other thing we have to look at is the property values. Are the property values higher because we have a well-managed prairie? And then how does that translate to for our neighbors? All individual decisions affect the community. It's not just us. So there's a permanent landscape. This is actually one of those fens I was talking about down in here. This picture will look pretty much the same in 25 years as it does right now. Probably it looks as close to the first European settlers coming to South Dakota. And those headwaters are protected as until sod too. It restores the natural landscape function, the water flow, the water capture, the filtration, the spring and fen protection. But keep in mind, we're still using livestock as a profitable tool, but we're using it in the form of conservation. And then if you look downstream into the community, healthy soil, clean water, they don't know where the property lines stop. Our neighbors have healthier calves because they have access to clean water too. And then what does that mean to have all the way from Watertown to Sioux Falls to have a community of sustainable agricultural businesses? This is an old dead cottonwood tree with a new tree growing out of it. It reminds me of something that I read in a Sand County Almanac. But how are we willing to take our past mistakes, our past successes, and what are we willing to do to build for that? And how can we? Are we willing to look at it in those terms too? Anybody have any questions? Yes?
Could you define a fen for us, please?
I'm not real good at that. I'm gonna let Pete do that.
What was the question?
What was a fen?
Oh, a fen. Okay, so a fen is an outflow area. It's similar to you kind of think about a spring, but what it does is where the land and the water table interact, and there's a certain, they're calcareous, so there's certain sediments and minerals and nutrients in that interaction. So it basically forms a prairie bog. It's the best way to say it. They can be on hillsides, they can be on flats, but they sometimes can be quite bottomless. There's one over by Arla's place that we measured was 28 feet deep. And so it's a cold water kind of spring with a very unique plant communities, very unique water, mineral contents, and that type of thing. And the Coteau, especially right up in their area, is the highest density of calcareous fens for certain in the upper Midwest, and probably the highest known. So they're very unique.
Did you have some more questions for Arla or Pete? Would you be available in the hall? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your